road trips. Now, the road trip is a rite of passage for most of us. I would bet almost everyone here at some point in their life was dragged on a road trip. And I actually have loved them ever since I was a little kid. My parents took me on my very first one when I was 9, and our final destination was the exotic metropolis of Toledo, Ohio. It was so glamorous for a kid who had never left Toronto before. And along the way, I discovered the joys of motels with beds that vibrated when you put a coin in them. And I learned that Americans didn't eat chips, but French fries, and they looked at you strangely when you asked to put vinegar on them. I learned a lot about my parents, too, like the fact that my dad would never, ever ask for directions anywhere, despite the fact that we'd routinely end up in some dodgy neighborhoods like we did on the outskirts of Detroit. I also learned that my dad, when he got us into predicaments like that, would just get angrier and angrier, and my mom would just laugh harder and harder, which made him angrier and angrier. I learned that road trips were a great way for the whole family to spend time together and annoy each other in much more interesting places than home. More importantly, I learned through those road trips that I loved history, and I loved traveling, and I loved meeting new people. Traveling is really a metaphor for life, isn't it? The journey of discovery that begins the moment we emerge from our mother's wombs and that doesn't stop, not even at the grave. The adventure just keeps on going. Well, today's Feast of the Epiphany, the climax of our Christmas celebrations, is in many ways all about traveling. The great poet T.S. Eliot gives, I think, the most perfect expression to the challenges that were experienced by these wandering wise men in his poem, The Journey of the Magi, which begins with one of them complaining. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of year for a journey, and such a long journey. The ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. Nothing romantic about that trip, at least not as far as Eliot is concerned. And to the members of the Jewish Christian community who would have first heard about these foreign travelers showing up in Bethlehem from St. Matthew 2,000 years ago, his claim that they would be the first to see this long-expected child, well, that would have been nothing short of scandalous on a number of levels to them. First of all, of course, these travelers were obviously outsiders. Where exactly in the exotic East they had come from is never made clear to us. Perhaps Persia, perhaps Arabia, perhaps Africa. Their origins wouldn't have mattered because the offensive thing to them was these people were not Jews. They were not part of the chosen people. They don't belong in this story. How dare they have the privilege of being the first to see the Messiah? Add to the mix this little crowd of travelers, they were also astrologers, claiming to be able to read the meaning behind the movement of the stars in the heavens. And, well, you've got another complication because Jewish law does not permit this kind of thing. And yet here they come, these oddly dressed aliens, guided by a star, according to Matthew, at least, the first to whom God presents his son, rather than to shepherds or to the faithful members of the Jewish community, the ones who had waited so very patiently for Christ's appearing. What was God thinking? Well, as Scripture shows us over and over and over again, our God appears to delight in overturning carefully constructed human conventions and human expectations. Through the wise men, God confirms for us that there is absolutely no room for exclusion in his plan of salvation. The Magi, they become our representatives at the cradle of the child who will ultimately embrace all of humanity, not just the Jewish people, when he extends his arms on the wood of a cross. These wise travelers remind us that if there were no barriers to worshiping the boy born in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, then the ones that we have erected over the centuries have absolutely no place either. The segregated churches of the American South, the exclusion of women from ministry in the church, the prohibition against certain Christians from participating in the Lord's Supper with us, the marginalization of gay people at this very moment by people who profess to believe in the mercy and love of God, and sadly the list goes on and on and on. These acts of exclusion are as offensive to God today as was the exclusion of the Gentiles from salvation 2,000 years ago. But if that is what God is trying to teach us about these amazing travelers, what might he be trying to teach us through them and their remarkable journey? Well, first off, I think the journey itself was worth pondering. Like Dad, they don't always appear to have known exactly where they were going or how they were going to get there. Nor are we told how long they wandered in search of this child. But one thing is certain, that although they set out on their quest as individuals, they eventually came together, and they moved forward as a single group, seeking one common goal. And while Scripture tells us that their gifts were three, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, it doesn't tell us how many of them actually made that journey, or how they found each other in the first place. But the important point is this: they didn't make this pilgrimage in isolation. They leaned on one another, comforted one another. They encouraged one another in the uncertainty of their travels. They have become for us, therefore, a model for what the Christian community should ideally be. Now, we have all heard friends and family, perhaps we've even heard ourselves say over the years, "Oh, I don't need to go to church to find God. I can be spiritual all on my own." And given what a mess the church can be at times, I understand that completely. But with all due respect, the wise men challenge that position today. They show us that the journey of faith is in fact a corporate one. It's by traveling together that we learn from each other. We bounce ideas off of each other. We challenge one another, and we share our joys and sorrows, our doubts and frustrations with one another, with one common purpose: to find God. To find God in our lives, to find the peace and love of God in the person of Jesus Christ. That's ideally what we do here at St. George's and in every other Christian community all around the globe. That's why we here haven't given up on this pilgrimage of faith. Because we know, despite it all, that we cannot find the love of God all by ourselves in isolation. But there is another important aspect of the journey of the Magi, and that's when they traveled. The cities hostile, and the towns unfriendly, and the villages dirty and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it, Eliot's wise man grumbles. At the end, we preferred to travel all night, sleeping in snatches, with the voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. Like us, the Magi would have journeyed at times in less than hospitable circumstances, experiencing discouragement along the way and unwelcome, probably, in many places. And since the star that they followed was eclipsed during the day by the brightness of our sun, they had to plot the course of their journey by night. Now, each one of us here knows darkness can be overwhelming. It holds so much uncertainty and so much fear, so many unwelcome surprises. And all of us from time to time have had to travel not just through the darkness of night, but also through the darkness of disappointment, of sickness and death, the loss of loved ones, fear for our world, fear for ourselves. And the temptation when we find ourselves in that kind of gloom is to turn inward and look downward, cautiously protecting ourselves, rather than lifting our eyes in hope to see that the star that once shone over Bethlehem still lights our path if we only look for it. God's light still shines in the faces of the people here who care about us. It radiates from Jesus' own words as we hear them proclaimed week after week, and it burns in our hearts as we reflect on his message. The Magi remind us that while our journey through life might often be undertaken in the dark, with painful and confusing twists and turns all along the way, the light of God still shines better and more certainly than anything else that this perplexing world might have on offer. And by basking in the radiance of God's love, we ourselves then actually become the light for others, shining in their gloom, the gloom of the many who are still wandering and bumping around in the midst of their own darkness. It's a commonplace that travel changes us. Most of us look forward to the adventure that awaits us as we're planning a trip somewhere new, and by the time we get home, if we're lucky, our experiences have actually changed us. They've broadened us a little. They've made us think about the world and ourselves in a different way. And I suspect that was exactly the same for the Magi. They left their homes and undertook an arduous trip under difficult circumstances with one goal in mind, and when they finally found the one that they were looking for, we are told they fell down and they worshiped. The one thing we are not told is what happened to them after they left Bethlehem, other than that they went back home by a different route. We return to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation with an alien people clinging to their gods. After their encounter with that divine boy on his mother's knee, their world must have seemed so much larger, and for them, life no longer could be the same as it was before they met that extraordinary child. But one thing is absolutely certain. Their journey of faith and hope together could never be untraveled. And so it is with us. Like those travelers of so long ago, let us recommit ourselves to moving forward on our journey of faith, especially as we begin this, what seems to be rather uncertain new year. May we focus not so much on the darkness ahead, but on the many lights that God constantly sends to brighten our shadows, helping us to maneuver around the obstacles that hinder us from finding Christ in our lives. May we learn to treasure the guides that God has so generously provided to brighten our way, both here at St. George's and in the world through which we travel every day. But most of all, let's never give up on the journey itself. Christ is still waiting to be found, often waiting in the most unexpected places. And it's the wise travelers who learned that lesson. And when we do find him, we can still offer the most precious gift that there is, the gift of ourselves. Amen.